When building with Velo and Wix, you may know that the Content Manager and Content Collections are only one option you have when considering where to store your data and how to structure it. If the Content Manager is not meeting your business needs, or perhaps you have a favorite database that you're really familiar with working with, you do have options when building your site. Today I'm going to show you how to connect Airtable to a Wix site enabled with Velo. First, let's take a look at the table that I've created within Airtable. It's really simple. I haven't created multiple tables, relationships, anything like that. So this is really just to get you started. There's plenty of documentation and a whole community space around Airtable. So if you have questions or are building something complex in there, that's the place to get started getting your questions answered about anything on the Airtable side. For this example, I've created a table for tracking expenses. It just has a description, an email field to identify who submitted the expense, a date that the last update was made, a status where you can decide whether it's approved or reviewed or anything like that, and then a total field that contains the cost. If you now head over to your website, you're going to want to start in the dashboard first and set up under the Developer Tools Secrets Manager 2 secrets. One should be for your Airtable API key, the other should be for your Airtable app ID. Make sure that these names of the secrets are something that makes sense to you and that you'll remember as they will function as your IDs when you're trying to access these secrets. To get started, I'll show you what the UI elements are we're going to be using, but we're then going to build out the backend logic first. So again, this is really simple. It's a repeater with your members area. I have a simple error message that's the same no matter what error is thrown. So obviously you would want to customize that for a real application. We have the date field is going to come in as a read-only text field, and the status. We have two inputs that are going to allow the user to interact with the description and the total. And then we'll have a hidden save edits button and a delete button for interacting with the repeater. Down at the bottom, we have just a simple form for creating a new expense and submitting that to the database. If we go into the code next, you're going to want to create a backend file called Airtable functions.jsw. You'll notice a few import statements here at the top. These are some things we're going to need. You want to import fetch from Wix Fetch, the Wix secrets backend, and current member because we're going to be evaluating who is actually logged in and attempting to read this data. So the first function that we're going to need to create is our get Airtable data function. The first thing you're going to need to do is get the key and the app ID from your Wix secrets. Again, this is the name that you gave to each of those secrets. Then next, we're going to want to get the current member. So we need the full field set. Now we have our API keys and our member data. For the get function, you can actually start with the snippet that's provided to you in the Wix Fetch documentation. It's very close to what we'll need, so you can actually start with that if you want. So the first thing we need to change, of course, is the fact that we need to return this from the function. If you don't put that there, it will return undefined, which is going to be highly confusing if you're expecting data. Next, we want to change this to be the Airtable endpoint. So for Airtable, all of their API calls start the same. It's the app ID and then your API key. After that, you'll notice I'm using another parameter called filter by formula. This is something Airtable offers for you to be able to filter that response and just get back the data you need. In our case, we want only the rows where the email matches the logged in member. Now, the filter by formula is based on SQL, and Airtable does have a little tool in their documentation where you can build out these formulas and it will then encode them for you because that is something that the API call will expect. You have another option, of course. You don't have to use this to do your filtering. If you maybe have a more complex filter and it's making this API URL really messy, you could always pull back all of the data and then manually filter it yourself. Depending on what you're building, that may be a little heavy, but there could be a use case for needing more data than the filtered version here. So those are your two options, is to use filter by formula or just get everything back and filter it yourself in the JavaScript. We're going to keep the method as get, and here we are going to expect to get some JSON back. So the only other thing we need to change is that we're not doing any console.logging here. We actually want to return these. And for Airtable, it'll be records on the JSON. So now this function is ready. To keep going with the CRUD application, now we've got the R, we're reading the data. The next function that I'm going to create is a create or update data. For this function, I've decided to put those two API calls into one function. This is just one option of how you could handle this. You can split these apart. So let's take a look at what is going on here. For creating or updating the data, we're going to be passing an object to send to Airtable, an action so we know whether we're creating new data or updating it, and an ID set to 0 because we only need to pass an ID if we're updating. If we're creating a new row of data, Airtable will be creating a new ID for us. Again, you'll need your keys. The URL and the method are going to be modified depending on if we're creating or updating data. So you're going to want to have a little variable instantiated to use in that case. We're going to pass an action from the front end. If the action is create, we're going to add just the API key to the end of the URL. The method will become post, and then for the create new, there's something we have to add to the object. We are adding the email, again from current member, but in the backend, and we're adding the status of submitted. That's just going to be our kind of imaginary business requirement that every new expense automatically gets a status of submitted. We're adding these here instead of in the front end because there's no reason for the user to be able to interfere with what that data is. We want to set it in the back automatically. If the action is update, then we're going to pass that ID of what the row is that we're going to update, and the method then becomes patch. The reason I combine these two is because the fetch looks the same for both of these. The method changes and the URL changes, but they both accept the same headers and they both need an Airtable object and should return a similar kind of response. So in the response, you'll notice that we had to change something based on the different from the code snippet for the get. We're not getting any JSON back. We're not getting any data. All we're getting back is whether or not this worked or not. But you need to be able to tell the front end that this did return successfully. So in my case, I decided to create a little object that's just success is true. There's a few ways you could handle it. This is one. And then in what I'm returning to the front end, I'm just returning results.success. You could return the whole object because you may want a more detailed object depending on what kind of data and what kind of API call you're making. And then you could return the whole results objects and look for result.success or result.error or something else. You have some options here. The most important takeaway is that you do need to decide what you're returning to the front end when there's no data coming back. So now we have our update and create new taken care of. So the final function that you're going to want to create is a delete function. The delete function is pretty simple for Airtable. Delete. It will need to take a parameter of the ID. It needs to know what we're deleting. And the only thing it needs to know is the row ID. You don't have to pass any object or anything like that. All right, let's grab these guys. And then this fetch is similar to the one for the create or update in that we're not returning any data, so you just need to be able to tell the front end if it was successful or not. You're passing in the ID, and the method is now delete. Actually, let's make this uppercase to make it consistent there. So we're returning that the success is true, and then we're returning that result to the front end. These are all of your backend functions that you will need. So next you can go over to the page code. The reason I like to do the backend functions first in the case of interacting with IDs is you can test each one of these functions by feeding in some dummy data. You can put your own email here. You can make sure that each one of these is working before you connect it to the front end. It's a lot easier to debug that way instead of hooking everything up and not knowing if it's your front end or your back end that's the problem. So this is the way I like to start. Definitely do whatever works best for you. In your page code, you'll want to make sure that you've imported all of these new functions from your backend. In your onReady, you're going to set this to an asynchronous function, and then we're going to await a function we're about to create called getExpenses. GetExpenses, actually, hold on, let's do this too. We need to set this repeater data to an empty array. There's nothing in it to start until we get the results of the getExpenses. So the next thing is to create this getExpenses function. For that, we're going to call the getAirtable data. When results come back, the first thing that you need to do is map the ID that's returned from Airtable to the underscore ID that's required as the unique identifier for repeater data. When you're structuring a database that is outside of your content collections, you have two options. You can either make sure to always include an underscore ID in your table design. In the case of Airtable, I don't get to decide what the ID field looks like. It's just ID. So for me, it's easier at this point to just map that key to a new key name that I'm going to create, which is going to be underscore ID. This way I can maintain that relationship and know what the row ID that I need is in Airtable, but also have the data that's required to actually populate the repeater data. So what we're doing here is mapping the old ID key to the new ID value and leveraging the JavaScript REST operator to make sure that that persists throughout the rest of the keys. Once we've mapped that value, we can now set up our repeater data. We're going to take that new array with the underscore ID now and map it to the data on the repeater, and then in the onItemReady, we're going to set each repeater item to the value in the array that we want. Notice that we have two text areas, which are our read-only labels, and then two values, which are our inputs. Then we'll just set up a little place to make the error message show if that API call fails in any way. We have a few other functions to hook up here. Notice I've already added the click events. If you haven't done that before, if you click on any kind of button, any interactive element that you add in the editor, off to the side here you'll see where you can just add some event handlers. Of course, you can also manually write these in code yourself if you prefer, if you have a structure and a way that you like to organize your code. So the next thing we want to think about is how to sense that a user has interacted with the inputs in a particular repeater row. To do this, I've actually installed a NPM package that was created by a developer here at Wix to make interacting with repeaters and knowing which repeater item you're interacting with a little bit easier. This is called repeater scope, and it's a public NPM package. You can go ahead and use it whenever you want. And it's just meant to make it a little bit easier to get to these IDs and get to the data that is on a repeater. You do not have to use this. There is a way to get to it through the event context of, say, like a click event, which we'll also show you in a little bit. So if you're using this NPM package, make sure that you import use scope from repeater scope. Next, in your onReady, we want to be able to hear whenever a user interacts with the total or the description inputs, but we want to know exactly which one they interacted with. So this is where you're going to use the scope of the event of the repeater item, and then access that item to show the Save Edits button only on the repeater item that the user interacted with. So let me show you what I mean by that. On the front end, you see that I've gotten my 2 rows of data that I should get from Airtable based on my user. And you'll see there's no save buttons here now, but if I were to interact with this, I have a Save Edit button now, and I have it on the repeater item I'm currently interacting with. If you didn't use the scope to get to this repeater item, what would happen when I interact with this is that all of the Save Edit buttons would show. So it's really important to have that code there so you know where exactly the user is interacting with your repeaters. Now that we have the correct buttons showing, we need to hook up what happens when a user clicks the Save Edits button. When the user clicks Save, we're going to want to access the context of the repeater item that they clicked on. We're going to set some variables that we'll need to send in the Airtable object. We'll need the ID, the total, the description, the date, and the date formatted so that it's ready for the Airtable data. You may notice that I'm collecting the total and the description inputs no matter which one the user touched. In the case of this example, that's fine, but what you would likely want to do in your application, as you're likely gathering more data and there's more going on, you would want to evaluate what the user has actually interacted with by leveraging the scope of this repeater item and seeing what the data was previously and whether or not it has changed. When you're building the Airtable object, it's important to remember that Airtable is very picky about the data structure of what you're sending. If, for example, you didn't format the date exactly as you have it formatted in Airtable, the API call will fail and you'll get some unusual errors. So the first place to start if you're having trouble updating data is making sure that the way you set up your data structure in Airtable exactly matches the structure in which you're sending the data. We're going to set the action equal to update so that our backend function knows what kind of action we're trying to complete. And then call creator update data, passing the object, action, and the ID. When the results come back, we're going to hide that repeater button. We're going to get the expenses again and update the repeater data. And if anything fails, we're going to show the error message. We have a couple more functions to complete here that are fairly similar in nature. There are a couple of different caveats for each. For the delete, you only need to get the ID. Now, this is a different way to get the ID out of your repeater that the user has clicked on. In this case, I'm just drilling down into the event context and grabbing the item ID. This is another way that you can get to the exact repeater that the user has clicked on. Now that you have that ID, send it to the delete Airtable data function, check to make sure that the function was successful, and again, we're refreshing the data. Pretty similar in each case here what we're doing. Finally, when you have the user submit new data, there are a couple of differences here. Again, we're grabbing all of the values of the inputs, so we're creating a formatted date, and we're building this Airtable object again. In this case, we're setting the action equal to create for our backend function, and when we call creator update data, we're not sending an ID because we don't have one. The only other thing that's different here is once we're sure that the API call was successful, you'll notice that I've wrapped the getExpenses call in a set timeout. This is because when creating a new row of data in Airtable, I noticed when building this there's a little bit of a lag on then getting all the new records. If I try to call getExpenses right when the API call returns as successful, it's a little too early to get that full new row of data. Wrapping it in a small set timeout solved this problem for me. So that's something you can play around with. You want to make sure the user isn't confused when they add new data if they don't see it. Let's take a look at the front end. You can see that my repeater items have loaded. If I start editing a description, the appropriate button does show up. If I click Save, that button disappears. This repeater has been refreshed. If I choose to delete an item, we can see that the repeater is refreshed and shows that the item has been removed. And if we put in a full new request, again, the repeater is updated with that new request. Notice that I didn't do anything with the format of how the data is returned, the sorting. So depending on your use case, you're going to want to take care of that when you build out your production-ready application. One thing to note when working with Airtable is if you intend to have a business use case where there would be editors working in the Airtable database itself, say, for example, updating these statuses, there is no webhook exposed on field data changes from Airtable, so there's no way for you to sense in your app when there's been a data change. There are two potential ways to handle this. In Airtable, they do offer something called automations that you can essentially write your own webhook to make sure that you can sense when data has changed in Airtable. Or if you want to keep all of your code within your Velo website, you could refresh the data here on an interval if the user's sitting on the page. Or you could do something like create a timestamp here to let the user know when the data is accurate as, and give them a little button that says refresh, that they can refresh the data themselves. It really depends on your use case and what's going to be best for your users and your business. Thanks for watching. I hope this helped show how easy it is to set up an API-enabled database and connect it to use as a backend for your Velo website.